Harland Sanders was not born into greatness, he was born into hardship in a small farmhouse in Henryville, Indiana in the year 1890. He opened his eyes in a world that never promised him anything. His father was a hard-working man, a farmer who labored through the day and prayed at night, but when Harland was just 5 years old, everything changed. His father suddenly passed away, leaving behind a broken family and a 5-year-old boy who was too young to understand death, but old enough to feel pain. His mother was now alone with 3 children, and the crushing weight of poverty on her back. To survive, she took whatever jobs she could find, and Harland at just 5 started learning what survival really meant. He wasn't in school learning how to read or write, he was in the kitchen learning how to cook for his siblings. He didn't have a playground, he had a wood stove and a crying baby to feed. By the time he was 7, he had already mastered basic Southern cooking. His hands were small but steady, his eyes focused, his mind far older than his body. By 10, he was working on a local farm for pennies just to bring home some food. Every day was hard and no one came to rescue him. As he grew up, Harland moved from job to job. He worked as a streetcar conductor, a railroad fireman, a farmhand, a salesman, and even studied law by correspondence. But every time he thought he was getting somewhere, life would pull him back down like a cruel tide. He lost jobs, got into fights, and even got fired from the railroad after punching a colleague. In a moment of anger, he tried his hand at law, but his career ended almost as soon as it started. When he lost his temper in court and physically attacked his own client, he was not a polished man, not the kind of person society celebrates. He was raw, rough, and always fighting against the current. He got married at the age of 18 to a girl named Josephine. They had 3 children, but tragedy followed them like a shadow. One of their sons died at a young age. Their marriage was strained and eventually fell apart. Josephine left him, taking their 2 surviving children with her. Harland was devastated, but he couldn't afford to stop moving. Life didn't wait for broken hearts. By his mid-30s, he had tried dozens of professions, none of which lasted and none of which gave him peace. He was not famous, not rich, not respected. He was just another man who had been broken by life too many times to count. By the age of 40, he found himself in Corbin, Kentucky, running a small service station that also served food. And this was not some 5-star restaurant, it was a simple roadside kitchen where he would cook for travelers, using recipes he had developed as a child. Dishes like fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and biscuits, all made from scratch, the way his mother had taught him when he was just a boy with no father and an empty stomach. People started to love the food more than the gas, more than the service station itself, and word began to spread. His cooking had soul, it had warmth, it had history. Soon he turned the gas station into a small restaurant called Sanders Court. Calf and business grew, people would travel for miles to eat his chicken, but even then he was not wealthy. He was surviving better than before, but he was still living on the edge of financial ruin. Every day he woke up with doubt in his chest, but fire in his belly. Then came another storm. The government built a new interstate highway that bypassed his town completely, and within months his restaurant was nearly empty. The flow of customers vanished, and with it his income. He was now 65 years old, nearly broke again, living off his small social security checks, and wondering if this was how his story would end. He looked around and saw nothing left except one thing. His recipe was the same recipe he had been perfecting for decades, a blend of 11 herbs and spices that gave his chicken a flavor no one could copy. He decided that if he couldn't bring people to his restaurant, he would take his chicken to the world. At 65, when most people were retiring, Harland Sanders put on a white suit, grew a goatee, and started driving around America, knocking on restaurant doors, asking if they wanted to buy his fried chicken recipe. Most said no. In fact, more than 1,000 restaurants rejected him. Some laughed, some ignored him, some slammed the door in his face. But every time he heard a no, he got back in his car and drove to the next place. People thought he was crazy, an old man chasing fried chicken dreams with nothing but a battered car and a paper bag of seasoning mix. But he believed in what he had. He believed in his recipe. And more than that, he believed that it was not too late. He had nothing to lose and everything to prove. He had failed so many times that fear had burned out of him. All that remained was determination and hunger, not for food but for purpose. One small restaurant agreed to use his recipe, and then another, and slowly, the KFC brand was born, not from investors or marketing agencies, but from the hands of a tired man who had been rejected over and over again. By the age of 70, Colonel Sanders had hundreds of franchises, and his chicken was loved by millions. He became a global icon not because he was the best businessman or the smartest chef, but because he refused to quit. He once said, "I made a resolve then that I was going to amount to something if I could, and no hours, no amount of labor, no amount of money would deter me from giving the best that there was in me. And that quote wasn't a slogan, it was his life. Colonel Sanders wasn't a man who won because life was kind. He won because he didn't give up when life was cruel. He was broken and rebuilt again and again. His face on every KFC sign is not just a symbol of fried chicken, it's a symbol of perseverance, of grit, of a man who believed that even after 65 there's still time to start again. Colonel Sanders sat behind the wheel of his old car, the road ahead endless and the rejections behind him too many to count. He was 65 years old, broke and tired, but every time he stopped to rest, he remembered what it felt like to go to bed hungry as a child. He remembered what it was like to see his mother cry when there was no food left in the house. He remembered what it was like to lose job after job and yet still get up every single time. The pain did not push him down, it pushed him forward. He had his white suit, his signature goatee, and a brown paper bag filled with his special blend of herbs and spices. It was not much to most people, but to him it was gold. Every door he knocked on was another chance. Every no was just a delay, not a defeat. He would walk into restaurants with confidence and ask the owners if they would like to taste something special. Some would laugh, some would refuse before even tasting, but he never stopped believing that someone somewhere would see what he saw. Then finally one small restaurant owner gave him a chance. They cooked his chicken just like he taught them, crispy golden with the secret blend of flavor that danced on the tongue. When customers started loving it, the owner told Sanders that he wanted more of that chicken, and that moment was not loud, it was not flashy, it was just a nod, a quiet yes. But to Sanders, it felt like the door to the world had opened just a crack, and that crack was all he needed. Soon there was another restaurant and another, and every one of them came with its own set of challenges. Some didn't cook it right, some didn't respect the brand, some refused to pay him what was promised, but Sanders stayed focused. He didn't chase fast money, he chased quality and consistency. He would drive thousands of miles to personally check how each place was doing. He didn't just sell chicken, he sold a standard, a story, a piece of himself. He was not a businessman in the traditional sense. He didn't sit in a boardroom or use spreadsheets, he used handshakes, trust and taste. He knew that every bite of chicken was a message that said this is real, this is what it tastes like. When someone refuses to quit, he would spend nights on the road, sleeping in his car, eating crackers, saving every cent just to keep the dream alive. He wore the same white suit over and over because he could not afford a new one, and that suit became his armor, a symbol of a man who was too old to play by the world's rules. So he made his own people, started noticing not just the food but the story, the old man with fire in his eyes. The man who refused to retire, refused to give in, refused to be forgotten. By the time he was 73, KFC had grown into more than just a few restaurants. It had become a franchise empire with hundreds of locations across America and even outside the country. He had built this with no marketing team, no investors, no shortcuts, just grit and flavor. But growth brings pressure, and with pressure came big decisions. Sanders was offered $2 million to sell his company. It was a lot of money, especially for a man who once lived on Social Security checks. He thought long and hard about it, and in the end he accepted, but with a condition: he would remain the face of the brand, the heart of it, because he knew that KFC without him was just another name, but with him it was a story. Even after selling, he didn't rest. He traveled constantly, visiting new outlets, ensuring the food met his standard, meeting customers, shaking hands, taking pictures. He became a legend, not just because of what he built, but because he stayed in it, heart, soul, and spirit. He didn't walk away after success. He stood taller because of it. He didn't say, "Look what I did." He said, "Look what I'm still doing here." Life was far from perfect. Fame brought criticism, and business brought politics. Some accused him of being too strict, too old-fashioned, but he didn't care. He was not trying to be liked, he was trying to be remembered. He would say, "I'm not in this for a quick buck. I'm in this because it means something," and that something was bigger than fried chicken. It was a legacy built on failure, rebuilt with fire and seasoned with faith. In his final years, he kept traveling, appearing in ads, sharing his story, encouraging people to keep going, no matter how many times they fell. He believed that purpose had no deadline, that dreams don't expire with age, that if you still have breath, you still have a shot, and people listened. Not because he was rich or famous, but because he was living proof that life begins when most people think it's over. He would often sit quietly after long trips and smile, not because everything had gone perfectly, but because he knew he had given it everything he had. No regrets, only stories of the times he almost quit, and didn't only memories of those cold nights in the car and warm days in the kitchen. He knew the difference between losing and being lost, and he chose to keep walking every single time he became a symbol across the world, a white-haired man in a white suit, smiling from every KFC bucket, his face on signs, buildings, commercials. But behind that image was still a man who had once scraped for coins, who had once tasted more failure than success, who had once been told he was finished and yet decided to start again. Colonel Sanders was not famous because he made chicken. He was famous because he made a life from nothing. He was famous because he turned rejection into rhythm, pain into process, hunger into hope. He never stopped moving, never stopped trying, and even when the world told him he was too old, too slow, too late, he kept showing up with a bag of spices and a recipe that said otherwise. He was now a global face, known in countries he had never even visited. The image of an elderly man in a white suit smiling from a red bucket had become one of the most recognized symbols in the world, but what the world saw was only the surface. Behind that smile was a man who still believed in hard work, discipline, and showing up every single day. Colonel Sanders did not rest after selling his company. He stayed active in every part of it, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Because KFC was not just a brand to him, it was a lifetime of pain converted into purpose. He would wake up early, dress in his signature white suit, comb his hair, and start his day with the same energy he had decades ago. He traveled constantly, visiting outlets, personally talking to managers, checking quality, tasting food, shaking hands with employees and customers. He didn't just represent the brand. He carried its soul. Even in his 70s and 80s, when most people slowed down, he moved with the same passion and fire that got him through rejections, poverty, and loneliness. He had become a celebrity without asking for it. People would gather in crowds just to see him, speak to him, take a picture with him, but he never let fame change him. He still believed in doing things the right way. He still got angry if a restaurant didn't meet his standards. He still believed that food should be cooked with care and served with pride. He would walk into a franchise, taste the chicken, and if it wasn't perfect, he would not hesitate to express his disappointment, not because he was rude, but because he knew how much it had taken to build that name, and he wouldn't let it be disrespected. Colonel Sanders was not just guarding a recipe. He was protecting a legacy, a story that began in a broken home with an empty kitchen and had turned into a global empire. People started calling him a perfectionist, but to him it wasn't about perfection, it was about respect. Respect for food, for customers, for the years of struggle that came before the success. Despite the millions, the recognition, the corporate meetings, and the new world that surrounded him, he remained deeply connected to his roots. He often visited churches, schools, and small communities, not as a businessman but as a storyteller. He would talk about failure more than success, about being rejected over 1,000 times, about sleeping in his car, about being told again and again that he was finished, and how he refused to believe it. He would look into the eyes of young people and tell them it's never too late to start again. His words were simple but powerful, not because they were poetic, but because they were real. He never used big slogans or dramatic lines. He just spoke his truth, and that truth connected with people across age, race, and culture, because failure is universal and so is the need for hope. As KFC expanded into new countries, languages, and cultures, Sanders continued to travel. Despite his age, he visited Japan, Canada, the UK, and more, always in his white suit, always shaking hands, always tasting chicken, and always reminding everyone that this brand was not built in a boardroom. It was built in a gas station kitchen by a man who had nothing but a recipe and relentless belief. As the company grew beyond his personal control with new owners and global strategies, he stayed present. His voice mattered, his approval mattered, and even the biggest executives would pause to hear what the old man had to say, because he had built something that could not be copied, not just a taste, but a story. As the years passed, his health began to decline, but his spirit remained sharp. He would joke, laugh, argue, and inspire with the same energy he had when he was sleeping in his car and knocking on doors with a paper bag of spices. He never saw age as a limit. He saw it as proof that if you keep going, you win. In the last few years of his life, Colonel Sanders spent more time with his second wife, Claudia, a woman who had stood by him during his hardest years. She was not just his partner, but also the co-creator of many recipes and ideas. She managed their private affairs and supported his continued involvement in. They lived in a modest home in Kentucky, and he remained humble despite his fame. He did not build a mansion. He did not isolate himself from the world. He stayed among the people, always reachable, always real. Even in his last public appearances, his presence carried weight, not because of corporate power, but because he was living evidence that a person could fail again and again and still rise. He was not a man of shortcuts. He believed that quality came from care and success from December 16, 1980, Harlan Sanders passed away at the age of 90, surrounded by family and with a world full of people who had tasted his journey through the food he created. His death was covered by newspapers across the globe, not because he was just a businessman, but because he was a beacon of hope. His funeral was attended by thousands, and even people who never met him felt like they had lost someone personal. But even in death, his story did not end, because what he left behind was more than a chain of restaurants. He left behind a message, a reminder that your beginning does not define your end, that poverty, pain, and rejection are not death sentences but training grounds, that age is not a wall but a doorway, and that sometimes the man who seems like he's done is just about to begin today. His face still smiles from every KFC box. His story still inspires millions who read about him, see him, or simply taste that signature chicken. What people eat in a KFC meal is not just food, it's the flavor of persistence, of refusal to quit, of belief that if you keep showing up your time will come. Colonel Sanders never claimed to be special. He just never gave up, and in a world full of people who stop too early, who fear rejection, who count themselves out before life even begins, he stood as proof that it is never too late, that the world doesn't owe you success, but it does respect those who earn it, and that the difference between a forgotten man and a global icon is the decision to keep going when everyone else says stop. That is the story of Harlan David Sanders, a man who was not supposed to succeed, who was counted out, who was overlooked, rejected, mocked, and broken, and who still rose, who still fought, who still served, and who still stands, not just in images or logos, but in every person who chooses to try one more time.